Sharp quality and beautiful bokeh, all in a mid-range lens. This is the Sony 50mm 1.4 GM lens. Today, I'll be taking a look at the Sony 50mm 1.4, which is a high-end prime lens with a Sony E-mount. It has a maximum aperture of 1.4, which makes it ideal for low-light situations and when you want a very shallow depth of field. This lens is the latest addition to the GM series, and I'll be making comparisons in relation to those lenses later in the video. But for now, I'm going to have the focus primarily on the 1.4. With all that said, let's get into the build quality of the lens. Build quality of this lens is exceptional. It has a very premium sturdy feel to it, and it's built to last. It's made of a combination of metal and engineering plastic, and it is also weather sealed, meaning it is resistant to dust and moisture. When you combine the weather sealing with the sturdiness of this lens, you have yourself a lens that is very much built for more challenging situations. The lens ring is incredibly smooth and responsive. In comparison to other lenses, I did find this focus ring to have little to no resistance, making for very quick and easy manual focusing. On the side of the lens, you have two focus hold buttons, which is one more than your standard lens. Pressing these will ensure that when you're adjusting focus, it will fix on that focus point that you pressed at. These buttons are incredibly easy to reach, and I found them to be very tactile and responsive. The focus hold buttons can also be customized in the camera menu for more specific functions. This makes these buttons crucial for when you need to access those specific functions very quickly. This is your standard autofocus button. Simply click it to move from manual to auto. Beneath the focus ring, you have the aperture control ring, which has a max aperture of 1.4 and a minimum aperture of 16. If you want to shift to auto aperture, simply shift this ring to A. For further adjustment on the aperture ring, you have the aperture click switch. Use this button if you want to switch from 1/3 click stops aperture to seamless aperture for a more smoother movement. In addition, you also have an iris lock switch, which ensures that you don't accidentally shift from one aperture to the other. A quick thing to note about the lens hood that comes with this lens is it moves away from your typical pedal design to a more flatter rubber rim design. This means that you're able to safely stand the lens on its lens hood without worrying about accidentally falling over. The Sony 50mm 1.4 is relatively compact and light. The lens weighs 516 grams, which is significantly lighter in comparison to the Sony 50mm 1.2, which is 778 grams. Comparing it to other lenses in the 1.4 GM series, this lens is fairly close to quality and build. The 24mm lens weighs 445 grams and the 35mm lens weighs just 524 grams. The near identical design and weight of these particular lenses means that if you're using a stabilizer or some sort of gimbal, you don't have to radically adjust the equipment every time you swap between these lenses, saving you a lot of precious shooting time. Among these particular GM lenses, you have 11 aperture blades in each of them, with a filter diameter of 67mm. This means you're getting near identical quality and build among the 50, 35 and 24 GM lenses. When it comes to autofocus quality, the 1.4 excels. It has an accurate autofocus system that tracks your subjects quickly and reliably. Another noteworthy thing about the autofocus on this lens is its silent operation. Inside the lens, you have two dual XD linear motors. Now these motors do two things. One is ensure silent operation when shifting between autofocus points, and also that your autofocus is quick and reliable. Now these motors do make the lens a bit heavier, but I think it's worth it considering the performance. Another thing to note about the autofocus performance on this lens is that when moving from the background to the foreground, there can be a little back and forth in autofocus. You can significantly minimize this if you switch from autofocus to continuous autofocus. This is a lot less noticeable on more newer cameras, but on all the cameras, I do recommend switching to continuous autofocus to minimize that back and forth. There is also a little bit of focus breathing when adjusting between focus points, although nothing major. When challenging the autofocus on this lens, I did find that it still struggles like most lenses in darker spaces, and particularly in front of pieces of glass where the foreground can be messed around with a bit. So I do recommend that if you shoot with this lens, for the most quick and efficient autofocus, be sure to shoot in a well-lit room and preferably somewhere where you don't have glass in front of you. Now when it comes to the bokeh of this lens, it is simply outstanding. It is incredibly creamy and natural, and it's a great way to separate your subject from their background. The quality of the bokeh can be contributed to a number of factors within the lens. First and foremost, the circular 11-bladed apertures inside. This increase in aperture blades means that the aperture opening is much more circular in comparison to older lenses, allowing for a much more natural transition into bokeh. The quality of the bokeh is also contributed to a number of glass elements within inside the lens. You have an advanced optical formula of 2 XA extreme aspherical lenses inverted together and 1 ED extra low dispersion element. The combination of these elements ensures that not only do you have a reduction in spherical and chromatic aberrations, it also means that you have a reduction in ghosting and lens flaring, as well as ensuring that your imagery is incredibly sharp and free from any form of color fringing. Alright, so let's talk about recommendations with this lens. Now this is a 50mm, which means it's very middle of the road when it comes to focal lengths. This is primarily a size you would use for sort of mid shots like this, or portraits, or much more closer subject shots. Typically, you wouldn't use it for very large landscapes or street photography, although, you know, do what you want, enjoy it. But with that said, I do recommend using this lens primarily for like a lot of portraiture, a lot of mid shots of subjects, as you really do get the most out of that bokeh, which helps to sort of remove all that crap in the background and make it more about your subject and less about the space that they're inhabiting. As well, another thing to consider is that this is the 1.4 and you have the more expensive 1.2. The 1.4 is a bit more accessible in terms of price. It doesn't have the same low light capabilities as the 1.2, but it does perform pretty damn well in low light situations. So I recommend if you're looking for something that's like a good lens for mid shots or something for portrait photography, and something where the focus is on your subject and not necessarily what's around them, then I do recommend reaching for the 50mm, as it is a high quality lens that is great in low light. But that's just my personal opinion, and it's always good to get a second opinion. So here's one right now from salesperson and Sony nut, Miguel.
I'd recommend it to people who want to do it for portraits and also at the same time who want a fast aperture lens. Personally, I'd use it for portraiture mostly, and maybe as well as low light, just because you got that 1.4 to work with. What I would recommend to buy with this lens, probably an A7 IV, just because of how light it is and because you have all the fast autofocusing features that incorporates it with the lens.